first, I would love to just jump in and hear biggest surprise to you coming out of this research. What was it?
I think that I wanted to believe we were altruistic actors, but actually we're self-interested. I think that was one of the biggest surprises for me. And I want to be clear about how I think this work relates to the work that all of you are doing around elections as well. So fundamentally, I'm an ethnographer. And people laugh at me when I use that word, but it's a real word. Like, it's actually a job. So I'm fundamentally focused on understanding how human beings what their attitudes and their behaviors are towards any particular research question, right? And so our interest was in understanding this particular, and now we know, sizable segment of the U.S. population. And in our research, we found that just over half of the people, half of interested bystanders, say that they vote. And probably that's a little inflated because whenever you ask somebody in person, face to face, when was the last time they voted, they're a little bit more positive about how frequently they vote than they usually do. But in any extent, this group of people are people who are generally electorally engaged, like every once in a while, basically. And so I know that many of you, obviously, in this audience are probably trying to engage people who fall pretty squarely into this segment of the population, interested bystanders. And so the direct connection, I think, between this research and elections has to do with the human participant. And I think more broadly, our findings on voting indicate, as I sort of mentioned here, that interested bystanders who are voting are not doing it out of a sense of altruism or passion or like delight about democracy. They're doing it because they think that they should. And thank goodness the ones who think that they should are actually doing it. But they don't really see how it connects back to the things that they care about in their communities, perhaps because they're voting in elections at the national level that are really the farthest removed from policing or public safety or development issues locally to them. So I think one of the many reasons that you all have been funded to work on this stuff is for the reason that, like, my friends from Democracy Works like to say, voting doesn't fit the way that we live anymore, basically. And so what you're doing is you're trying to make a connection between our daily lives and the mechanics of democracy. And I think that interested bystanders give us some clue about how to do that better.
So now what I'd like to do is take a step back, actually, in time, and try and better understand what your or Google's initial interests were in conducting this research, and specifically, again, tying it to the voting and elections component that is, I think, most relevant to all of us here today. And the one question that came up for me in reading the research was around the ultimate goal as it relates to the electorate, and whether it was A, around expanding the electorate and an interest in sort of growing the pie of voters, or B, if it was more about taking that pie as fixed and how do we really more deeply inform the existing pool of voters. And I ask this because I think, personally at least, I bring a little bit of skepticism to the first goal for two reasons. One, voter turnout has remained more or less stable in the US for the last 40 years, fluctuating a couple of percentage points here or there, but not a lot, not as much as we would like, I think. And then second, looking at a lot of the academic research on the use of tech tools in the voting space, most of the data seem to suggest that they're being used by existing voters and aren't necessarily as successful in attracting new voters. So I realize I bring sort of my own bias or questions around this, but would love to hear your thoughts on the feasibility of growing the pie versus more deeply informing the existing voters.
No, I think it's a fair question, and I mean this study was for us a way to try and dig into this segment of the population to understand how they might be more fully engaged in civic life to have kind of scale effects on democracy. So from that perspective, it's like a grow the pie study, basically. And importantly, when we were asking people to give examples of things that they did that were civic, we didn't define that word for them. We kind of wanted to see what emerged out of that. So we asked questions like, can you think of something you did recently, like in the last 6 months or whatever, that you would consider civic? And the first response was like, can you define what the word civic means? People wanted a definition of that word, and they weren't really sure sort of what it meant. But through their examples of civic engagement, as you can tell from the presentation that we just gave, they sort of feel that civic life is indeed inclusive of this sort of political component around voting and elections and politics. And as I mentioned, it's not an area that makes them feel very warm and fuzzy, but it's also for them, given the things that they said that they actually did that they think are civic, it's actually about this also broader component of kind of community and social engagement. And that's where they feel meaningful, that's where they feel purpose, that's where they can connect to things that they care about very closely. And so, and also have this sort of sense of, you know, self-fulfillment in a way, which is a very human desire, I think, among the population. So I think that, like, we in this room are very specifically looking at voting, and that's important, but one thing I want to emphasize is that it's just one option in a larger sea of options from the perspective of somebody who is an interested bystander. And so if there's kind of one thing I want you to take away from this point, it's that if we view the world through the lens of people who are interested bystanders, elections and voting is like one lever. And I think, I mean, to your point about, you know, not really seeing turnout increase all of that much, I think if we continue to view elections and politics as the key lever for most Americans, then we will, of course, only continue to see turnout increase by 1 to 3 percentage points, because it's just not their main focus necessarily. So I know that's, like, again, not really what you want to hear, but I think that, again, I think there are ways of bridging these two things, and we need to be more creative and bold about trying to do that.
Well, slightly less disheartening than the discomfort and shame discussion earlier that you mentioned that people feel when they talk about politics. Well, so now I want to jump to a question, and my last couple of questions are all around applying what you've learned to the work that this audience is doing, and it touches on some questions that I think Jonathan Cart and Peter Levine somewhere out there also mentioned. And you didn't go into this as much, but your work identified, I believe, 6 different segments, 3 of which you categorized as interested bystanders. And when I have seen market segmentation done in the past, primarily in a commercial context, it's been for marketing professionals who have a lot of really rich information about the socio-demographic characteristics of their segments. They know that segment A is comprised of women in their 30s who are professionals and live in urban areas and read magazines X, Y, and Z, and therefore they can reach them that way. And I think a lot of us in this room don't have that kind of detailed socio-demographic information. So I'm wondering how you imagine this group, how could they apply some of these segments to our work?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because that isn't something that I got to talk about, but we did both, as you mentioned, quantitative kind of market segmentation of the population based on civic characteristics. So that's nationally representative, statistically significant data. And we also developed out of our qualitative interviews a set of user personas, if you will, that surface a kind of human and specific different profiles of people that we came up with. So just actually to talk about one, for example, this is America. In America, work is apparently really important, right? This is like a theme of the way, who we are as Americans, and that came through in our research as well. And so actually 2 of our persona profiles had this element of careerism to them. So for example, at one end of the spectrum, we had folks who could be considered careerists first and foremost. This is kind of what we called them. These are people for whom the driving priority in their lives right now is mastery and success in their career. They're working 60 to 80-hour work weeks. They're generally young and unmarried. And if they do have free time, they're spending it sleeping or spending time with their friends, right? And so they don't really have a lot of time to do much more than, like, sign a petition every once in a while, even though they may be paying attention to news on their phone, on their way to the commute or something like that, and maybe voting. But it's hard for them to remember the last time they voted. At the other end of the spectrum, we had a group that we were referring to as kind of careerists with a cause. So these are people for whom career is also very important, and mastery and success in that career is primary, but they're interested in having more of a balance between their professional and personal lives. So they actually see civic engagement as an opportunity to bring professional skills to bear on an issue, and also receive some benefits for their resume in return. And so if we were going to design a product or implement a program or a policy, we would say, oh, they both have this thing in common, but actually we should probably be designing something completely different for this group than for this group. So one of the things that we wanted to try and do for this community was to surface some of that socio-demographic information and give a sense of what are some of the things that people feel are most important in their own lives, regardless of civic stuff or not, like what really matters to the people that we're talking with. And also try to do it in such a way to indicate how entities within the civic tech space can be just more user or human focused or human centered. I don't know that all of these personas or segments in the report actually fit what you're trying to accomplish, but there may be some overlap and they may be helpful in terms of thinking about how to structure some of your design.
Thank you. Okay, and then the last question, I'm going to bundle my last two in the interest of time. One to do and one not to do, by which I mean for the members, for all of us in this room, looking at your research, if there was one thing you would wish people would take away and do something about, and one thing that you think, oh God, I just hope that everybody stops doing or never does this, what would it be?
I like this question because I just get to opine.
In 1 second.
I think you should do. Okay, so the to-do for me is really clear. And I think at whatever level of resources that you're working with, take time, invest time before you design and just launch something to really identify who your target users are and learn what makes them tick. Just in hearing about a lot of your projects, there are a couple of me that stand out to me as having really forefronted the users, in particular Revive My Vote, that's forefronting people with criminal backgrounds as kind of a central user and thinking about how to work around them. And then also, forgive me, what's the name of the... Sharp Insight, which is really operating a world around barbers and men who want to get their hair cut. I mean, how much more everyday life can you get than that? So really thinking about who those central users are and understanding what your theory of change is related to that person, that human being. How is what you're going to do, what you're planning to do, how is it going to engage them, and what effect is that engagement really going to have? And I know that many of you are working with lean resources. It's not easy to launch like a huge user research study, but you can ask 15 friends of friends who fit your target profile for 20 minutes on the phone at regular points throughout your design process to get feedback and get information. And that's more data than you would have started with already. I know that the Knight Foundation has already invested quite a lot in this approach, and so ask them for some resources. So one thing not to do, don't be meek. I think that's my sort of not to do. I think that many of you, as you're kind of continuing down these paths, may discover that there are others who've maybe tried something similar before and failed. And I think it's probably a good idea to investigate, okay, what can we learn from that experience and not replicate in the work that we're going to do. And then think and act even more boldly than the people who failed. So learn from them. Don't do what they did. Do something different. It's not going to be different for you if you do exactly what they did, but be more bold, I think, in your thinking. And we also have this amazing opportunity where the press, thank goodness, is going to focus on democracy for like the next year and a half. And a lot of organizations and people with a lot of money also kind of get into the game at this point because everybody wants to have a strategy for 2016. And so we're in this moment in time where you can take advantage of both the press and the money available to make big bets, basically, and to be even bolder in your thinking than you might have been otherwise. So I think that would be that. And then just finally to end, I mean, as I mentioned, I think it's so important to the health of our civic life that all of you winners, and even the people who didn't win but have really great ideas, are contributing their time and energy towards this. And I would say it's a great privilege to have this award, and use it if you can to bring new people into the fold, folks who wouldn't otherwise be in this room but who can be really strong collaborators with us in getting to a kind of healthier place with our democracy. So those would be my thoughts.
Thank you, Kate. I thought this was going to be fun.